Hey everyone, what up? Matt Kaiser here. JRPGs. I love them, you love them, we all love them. Sometimes. Now, obviously, when it comes to JRPGs, even myself, would like a really, really great JRPG, whether it's, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, as well as ones like, Persona 5 Royal, Dragon Quest XI, Yakuza Like a Dragon, Tales of Arise, Kingdom Hearts, all that good stuff, and Xenoblade Chronicles 3. All of it really, really great games. And of course, there are some JRPGs that we might definitely not like, especially in the cases of Babylon's Fall, and also some other JRPGs that are really just bad. Take Taylor the Gaming Shelf, for example, who played some of the worst JRPGs you can find on PS4. Wow. But I ask you a question. What about JRPGs that generally the consensus is that the audience or the critics just don't like, but when you play them yourself, you personally think, it's not that bad. In fact, I quite like it. I like it a lot. So yeah, pretty much that's what this video is. So what I did was gather a bunch of JRPG content creators to list down their picks for JRPGs that we like, but maybe others don't. But before we begin, if you like what you've seen here, then by all means like the video, click the subscribe button if you're new, and hit that bell notification icon if you want to get updated by all future JRPG content from yours truly. Not only that, but I'm also planning to reach a milestone of 500 subscribers at least by the end of this year, so by all means, do yourself a favor. Now back to the video. So yeah, in this video, I thought I would have a bunch of my friends list down on what they think are JRPGs that they personally liked, that others mainly don't like. And by the end of this, I will list down what is my JRPG that I like that others don't like. So, let's take it away.
Hi everybody!
Thank you for having me on, Mad Kaiser. I greatly appreciate it. So when you asked me which JRPGs I feel are overhated, I had to think on that for a bit. I debated between Resonance of Fate, which was hated on for some of its oddball mechanics, or Valkyria Chronicles 4, which took too safe an approach with the franchise, and just felt like a more souped up version of the first Valkyria Chronicles game. Ultimately, I chose Valkyria Chronicles 4 because fans have hated that game so much, I very much doubt we'll ever see another title in the franchise. Now, keep in mind, I do not love Valkyria Chronicles 4. I think it's a good game, but I don't have the love for it I have for the first title, which was loved by critics and JRPG fans alike. So if I don't love Valkyria Chronicles 4, why did I choose it for my title? Because I still feel there's a lot of blood left in the Valkyria Chronicles franchise despite Sega fucking up royally with Valkyria Revolution, which was supposed to be a spin-off title, and them effectively throwing Valkyria Chronicles 4 out there to die. The game introduced a new class, which I loved playing around with, and having a troop carrier for the mechanical side was a nice tweak to the gameplay as it made mobility massively improved. However, like I said previously, Sega played it way too safe with this entry. Valkyria Chronicles 2 and 3 did much more to shake up the formula. 2 added subclasses to the main ones, which was a great idea, and 3 iterated on that idea. So seeing that feature removed upset fans of the franchise, and reasonably so. But if you look at Valkyria Chronicles 1 and 4, the only titles that are readily accessible to Western audiences, the core gameplay is great. Basically, Sega just gave us more of the same, but tweaked with the 4th title. I feel like had Sega incorporated ideas from the 2nd and 3rd titles, fans of the franchise would have eaten it up far more and actually loved it. So overall, I don't hate Valkyria Chronicles 4, and I actually like it a lot. I just feel like it was played too safe, also since it doesn't require you to know anything of the backstory of the first game, you can easily hop in with Valkyria Chronicles 4, as the events of it take place concurrently to the events of the first game. making it more akin to the first and the third game, where the story isn't a direct continuation of the events set up in the first one. So I'd highly recommend playing it if you like strategy RPGs or third-person shooters. It's kind of a hybrid of both, making it a rather unique experience. Also, you can acquire it cheaply now, so it's worth experiencing at a lower price point. I know I was disappointed with the game at full price, but if you can get it for around $30 or so, it's well worth checking out, as you'll be playing it for a long time. So from a value standpoint, the game is hard to beat. Thanks again for having me on, Matt Kaiser. I'm sorry it took me a while to get the audio to you. I hope the video performs well, and I can't wait to see some of the other games mentioned here.
I'm the UnKamen Soul, and I have a JRPG I really like that may not get a lot of talk. Khemia, Alchemists of Al-Revis. It's the 9th entry in Gust's Atelier series, where you play as Al-Revis, an amnesiac student attending the renowned Al-Revis Academy. An old friend of his dad's invites him to attend, and Vane ends up working with a cast of students to learn alchemy, complete class assignments, help a boisterous ally's workshop to prosper, and learn about himself. Like the games before, alchemy is key for a lot of things, but unlike them, both alchemy and combat help to boost the characters. Action points are earned after defeating enemies, and are then spent in each character's individual Grow book, where the stat boosts and new skills await. As you make new items, those AP can be spent for growth rewards, and as you progress through the game and learn new recipes, the Grow Book's rewards expand tremendously. Pain points include a dragging academy aspect, a lack of freedom in time and roaming, surely because they're school students, lack of difficulty, and separate item and equipment alchemy. As my first atelier, I wouldn't know any better, and I didn't know it wasn't always school days in the first place. I was fond of the Grow Book though. It reminded me vaguely of AP and the Sphere Grid of Final Fantasy X that I had played prior, and I've noticed I can be a real appreciator of the grind in JRPGs. So I knew that eventually, the work I'd put in for alchemy would bear some super ripe fruit. There can be a lot of talking before the next major story beats, but at the time I played it, I was patient enough for it, and because it was the suggestion of a dear friend of mine back when I was in high school, this game has a lot of personal meaning for me.
A JRPG that I really enjoyed that a lot of people didn't was Disgaea 6, Defiance of Destiny. I personally really liked this game, but it got mixed reception from a lot of critics and reviewers on YouTube. A lot of people judge this game for it being way too hand-holdy, and kind of just way too easy in general, but that's partially why I really liked it, because it was my first game in the Disgaea series, and the tools that were given to you, like the automation to be able to have the game do certain things for you, and like if this then that kind of automation system, I thought that was really fun to play around with and made the grindy parts of the game easy when people otherwise wouldn't really want to grind in a JRPG. This kind of gave you an alternative, but was also creative that you could kind of customize it to whatever you're focusing on trying to do in the game. And as far as the story goes, people really didn't like the story because they thought it was just I found the story kind of entertaining. The characters were varied, and there was just a funny dynamic with everybody interacting with the protagonist, so I thought it was a really charming game, and it's gotten me excited for Disgaea 7.
Has it ever occurred to anyone that sometimes there's this like really standout game and then barely any reaction following it? Like, wow, this was so good, I'm absolutely certain that some people should hear or be more aware about this. Honestly, thinking about it for so long now, or at least after the year that it came out, that's kind of how I felt for Soul Hackers 2 when it first landed. Like most things, the characters and the cast, and especially Ringo being at the forefront of it, was probably the most compelling part. You know, them being a full-fledged adult cast, and all the other array of characters allowed for there to be so much relatability, practically out of any scenario, with like so much ease. So, yeah, narratively and emotionally, I feel like this game was such a huge pillar when it first landed and launched. Like, and it seriously landed on both of its feet quite well. Funnily enough, I feel like whenever I look anywhere else, the praise for it was actually kind of like divided. And it was for like very minute details, honestly. Because people were saying, oh, like the base levels and the dungeon designs were like so uneventful or boring or repetitive. And like, sure, but if you look at any of their pre-existing titles, like any Shin Megami Tensei title within it, say like Shin Megami Tensei 5 or 3, they actually follow a lot of the same core features and design elements. So technically speaking, that really isn't a problem if it was a pattern in everything else, or at least to me it wasn't. So I feel like, honestly, thinking about it now, like Soul Hackers 2 was such a good game. I've been telling people all the time that like if Anno Mutationum, which was my game of the year for that year, which was another really good indie game, if that didn't exist, I feel like Soul Hackers 2 would easily been my game of the year for that year, and I honestly feel like more people should appreciate it. So yeah.
Hello, Chicken Fillets here, and thank you to the Mad Kaiser for asking me on to this collaboration. Now, when I got asked a question about a JRPG that I like that many don't, the first game which came to mind straight away was Final Fantasy XV. Now, Final Fantasy XV did release with a lot of controversy, and that's because, well, it wasn't really a completed game as such. Now, if you know Final Fantasy XV's history, it went through development hell. Another sticking out point for a lot of Final Fantasy fans is this was the first time we've seen Final Fantasy, well, a mainline Final Fantasy, come away from the traditional turn-based combat. But really, why do I like this game as much as I do? Now, to give you an understanding, I was on the hype train for this game when I found out it was being announced. I was one of these people that bought the Final Fantasy Type O game for the Final Fantasy XV demo, and I loved every second of that demo. I have fond memories of it. And when I got my hands on Final Fantasy XV on day one, I got the Kingsglaive edition, which had the Blu-ray, and I lapped up everything which was Final Fantasy XV. I loved my time with Noctis, Ignis, Gladio, and Prompto, and the game's villain, Arden Azunia. Oh, he is such an awesome villain. And now when the DLC did come out, I loved every second of that as well. I just love these characters, and I love the world of Final Fantasy XV. Also, Final Fantasy XV has a banger of a soundtrack, and no one can tell me that I'm wrong with this. Or you can, just do it in the comments. But what I want to know is Final Fantasy XV a game that you like, or is it a game that you do not like? Let myself and Mad Kaiser know down in the comments down below. And please remember to like and share this video, and give Mad Kaiser a subscription as well whilst you're at it. This has been Chicken Fillets, and until next time, tatty bye.
Hi everybody, this is Kevin, and thank you Mad Kaiser for inviting me to be a part of your video. Today, I would like to talk about Final Fantasy VIII and why I consider it to be the most underappreciated of all the Final Fantasy games. It's pretty crazy to think that way back when, in the late 90s to early 2000s, Square Enix, once known as Squaresoft, was able to release 4 legendary Final Fantasy games in the span of 5 years. And those games, of course, would be Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy VIII, Final Fantasy IX, and Final Fantasy X. And it all started back in 1997, all the way up into 2001. And what's often considered the black sheep of those games is Final Fantasy VIII. And I guess I can understand why, because you have Final Fantasy VII, which was the game many people were first exposed to turn-based RPGs for the very first time. And then Final Fantasy IX, another game many of which considered to be the best in the series. And then, of course, my personal favorite, and the first Final Fantasy game to make its way onto the PlayStation 2, Final Fantasy X. So that leaves little old Final Fantasy VIII lost in the shuffle. Now, it is kind of interesting to take a look back at the sales, and it sold very well, and honestly got pretty good critical success. But if you go on the internet, you'll constantly see videos saying that the game's no good, it doesn't make any sense, the junction system's confusing, the romance is not really doing it for me, and the whole 9 yards. And I guess I can understand it, but me personally, it was a game that I grew up playing. Of course, I played them all, but that was one that always resonated well with me, and, let's talk about it. One of the things that I really like about Final Fantasy VIII is the fact that it is the first game to utilize the realistic-looking character models. Of course, the first 6 games were stuck on the NES and SNES, and no disrespect to the graphics in those games, because they all held up extremely well, especially the SNES titles. But then you had Final Fantasy VII make the jump to the PlayStation 1, and you have the blocky polygon character models. You do have very beautiful-looking pre-rendered backgrounds, and of course the character portraits when you go into the menu. But with Final Fantasy VIII, I mean, these characters, this is legit, man. This is cutting edge. It does look extremely well for the time. Coming out in 1999, of course. And you're thrown right into the CGI cutscene where you have Squall facing off against Cypher in a duel with their gun blades. Which, what a badass name for a weapon, huh? A gun blade? And that's another thing, too. It's always sort of been a meme with the Final Fantasy characters. We can compare it again to Final Fantasy VII, where, we have Cloud with the Buster Sword, Tifa using her fists, Barrett with the gun for an arm. I mean, Red 13, what does he do? He claws at you, Sid with his lance, and then contrasted again with Final Fantasy VIII, where you have Squall utilizing the gun blade, Zell using his fists, Irvine with a shotgun, Quistis with her whip, and Selphie with some nunchucks, and of course for Noah, who uses like some sort of disc. And of course, Angelo! How can we forget Angelo? Which I hear a lot of people talking about Final Fantasy 16 and Torgal, but let's not forget, there have been dogs in the Final Fantasy universe before. Even before Angelo, there was Interceptor with Shadow. There's also a really sweet romance between Squall and Rinoa, which, again, some people don't really understand the romance because Squall has this introverted personality. You could say he's emo, he's edgy, whatever. I mean, he always says whatever. That's his little catchphrase. But as you play the game, you see the relationship develop between the two of them, and the climax, when they're in that certain scene, up in the air, we'll say, it really is something special. Final Fantasy VIII is also the first Final Fantasy game to feature a theme song with lyrics in Eyes on Me by Faye Wong. And it really is a beautiful song. I cry every time it plays during the game. It plays twice during a particular scene, and then of course during the credits. And it's just very emotional. It's very interesting too to note that Final Fantasy VIII was the first game to introduce that, which would later become a mainstay to the series. Of course, with Final Fantasy IX, you have the Melodies of Life, Final Fantasy X, Tsukido Ne, and you can go on down the line looking at all the other theme songs. But Final Fantasy VIII was the first. And honestly, the whole soundtrack by Nobuo Uematsu is just legendary. You have such songs as the Balam Garden theme, Laguna's battle theme, The Man with a Machine Gun. One of my favorite songs, Fragments of Memories, which I think only plays one time during the game, and that's when you control Laguna in the village of Windhelm, and you encounter Rain and Alone for the first time. Really love the song. There's just something about it. Look it up and listen to it for yourself. And of course, there's also Fisherman's Horizon, which is just this relaxing feel to it. So overall, what an excellent soundtrack. I also like how at certain points in the game, Squall and his friends will either go to sleep or the scene will just transition at the end of the disc and you'll take control of 3 other characters, Laguna, Kyros, and Ward. And let me just say, Laguna is my favorite character in the entire game. I absolutely love him. It's a shame you only get to play as him 3 or 4 times, although he does become more prominent toward the end of the game, and his connection to Squall is something special. It really a fantastic character, man. I absolutely love him, and it's cool to see how they sort of incorporate that in later games as well with Final Fantasy X, where you get the spheres, and you can see the progression of Jecht, Oron, and Braska's journey, and how it shows you their point of view. And that's always been a thing that fans have talked about, like, can we get a prequel game where we play as Jecht, Oron, and Braska? well, forget that. I'd like to see that too. But can we get a game about Laguna, Kyros, and Ward and their adventures of what happened fighting the dragon for the movie and all that crazy stuff they were up to? And of course, expand more upon the relationship with Laguna and Rain and Alone. The main reason why people don't like Final Fantasy VIII is because of the convoluted battle system and in turn the junction system, which I will admit is very confusing. I can only imagine first time playing it. I remember as a kid, first time playing it, I had no idea what I was doing, and I actually didn't really complete the game some years later, which I'm so happy I did. And honestly, Final Fantasy VIII is the type of game that requires multiple playthroughs to fully understand the story and comprehend the plot twists involved. But it's a game that doesn't like you to level grind, which is kind of odd coming from a turn-based RPG, because that's always the way you level up and get stronger and you can, breeze through the game with relative ease. But in this case, the random encounters scale with you. So you really want to avoid random encounters and figure out a proper strategy to junction the more powerful spells and just deal with bosses. Which leads into Triple Triad, the big mini-game of Final Fantasy VIII, where you can play cards. And there's an ability you can get early on where you can turn the cards into powerful spells. So while you'll fight a weak monster, you can draw fire or blizzard, whatever. You can use these cards and craft Ultima at the start of the game, which can break the game, but also makes it easier. Because honestly, you don't want to level grind in this game. And I feel that's the major turnoff for a lot of people, is the fact that, what do you mean you can't level grind? That's a lot of people's favorite thing to do in turn-based RPGs, but no, you really shouldn't level grind. And of course, with this being a JRPG, we have teenagers and young adults going around saving the world. Now, in this case, our main protagonists are part of the Balam Garden, and Irvine, he's part of a different garden, but of course eventually joins our group. And the garden basically teaches young adults and teenagers how to become mercenaries for this organization known as SEED, which is a very interesting concept, because usually, the main hero has his village destroyed, or he has amnesia, or whatever the case may be, and then he goes on his quest to save the world, whereas in this case, our heroes are already being bred for war and for battles and things of that nature. And I always thought that was an interesting twist. Going back to the whole level grinding ordeal, you don't get any kind of money from defeating enemies either. Because of the fact that you're part of the organization known as SEED, you have a rank as you progress through your missions, and as your rank goes up, you earn more money. And I believe that's based off of how many steps you take in the game, or it could just be the game clock, but periodically, they'll just give you more money. So that's another incentive not to grind. You don't need any money because you're just given free money. What a concept, what a world. I'd love to live there, wouldn't you? Another thing that is really cool in this game is the rivalry between Squall and Cypher, and how deep down I believe the two of them want to be friends, but they have to clash heads. It starts at the very beginning of the game where they're clashing heads, and that's actually where Squall and Cypher get the scars on their faces. And Cypher appears throughout the game, billed as a villain, but in the end, he never fully corrupts himself and turns evil, so I do like that whole concept. One of the scenes that always stood out to me was when Squall graduated and was promoted his rank in SEED. Everyone was sort of standing aside, and Cypher stood out and started clapping for Squall and congratulated him on his promotion, and that always stood out to me. They fight multiple times, multiple boss fights against Cypher, but deep down, they do admire one another, and I think it's an excellent rivalry between the two of them. Cypher never fully corrupts himself, and it's great. It's great to see it unfold. Final Fantasy VIII also brought forth more of the sci-fi elements, which have always been there, ever since the first Final Fantasy, of course, and, chaos, or as Jack would say, chaos! But with Final Fantasy VIII, you have more of a futuristic setting. The gardens that move around, they're sort of like airships to a certain extent, but you do get an airship later on, which is more or less a spaceship. You have a futuristic city in Estar, all sorts of mechs. There's talk of time compression, which is kind of similar to time travel, I guess, but they call it time compression. And you know, it's always cool to see the sci-fi element. It's interesting how Final Fantasy sort of introduces some of the sci-fi elements and then takes a step back, introduces it again, takes a step back, because if you pay attention here, Final Fantasy IX, which that gets into sci-fi toward the end of the game as well, but has more of a fantasy setting, and then with Final Fantasy X, you have like the beach island setting, and you know the deal. But it's always cool to see the sci-fi elements in the Final Fantasy games, especially in Final Fantasy VIII. I would like to once again thank Mad Kaiser for inviting me to be a part of his video, and I look forward to watching the other contributions. Thank you, and peace out.
And before I think we wrap things up, I might as well list on what is my controversial JRPG pick. And there was quite a lot to choose from, but if I had to pick one, especially since I think it's a little relevant now, it would have to be Star Ocean 4: The Last Hope. Now, when this game came around, like say 2009 and 2010 for the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, during a time where, of course, JRPGs were becoming a little bit of a norm to the Xbox 360, this game, of course, had some ambition, obviously trying to course correct after the rather controversial twist that Star Ocean 3 brought on, as well as using things like the engine from Infinite on Discovery, now modified, as well as going really heavily using the ideas from Star Ocean 3 and just doubling, increasing it by tenfold. And when it did launch, it did lead to some controversy and mixed reviews, especially in the case when it came to the story, the writing, and the characters in general, with me pointing out that the story itself is just dumb, boring, bloated, and absolutely nonsensical and ridiculous, as well as the characters, with some saying are just either bland or absolutely annoying with the overuse of anime tropes inherent, as well as the conscious, odd, infamous design choice that the Star Ocean series moving forward, especially in case of this game, VIII, and Divine Force, having, this weird sort of realistic meets anime kind of style that looks just jarring in a lot of places. But what do I personally think about it? Well, I think this controversy and all this divisiveness has really just, overshadowed a lot of aspects that this game has actually done really well that I think a lot of people tend to overlook. For one, I think the sci-fi realization was at its strongest in this game. I know Star Ocean 3, from what I'm playing, is close, and so is Star Ocean 6: The Divine Force, but I feel like Star Ocean Last Hope was the one that handled it better. And while the story may not be 100% great, I did like the origins of how things played out, like on why this whole space thing even began, and the whole creation of the Pan-Galactic Federation, especially since Star Ocean series does have sort of a timeline in a sense, especially since this game takes place before the events of the first game, meaning you get to, of course, go to that same planet, Rogue, which was quite nostalgic, especially coming off from First Departure. Not only that, but I thought the combat was its absolute best in the series before, again, Star Ocean 6: Divine Force took that crown, being very fast and fluid, having chain combos, as well as introducing the blind side, being able to dodge and counterattack enemies was so satisfying. And obviously you see that in now modern action RPGs in case of, like, say, Final Fantasy 16, Tales of Arise, Ys 9, all that good stuff. So having it here, and especially this game, was absolutely wonderful, and I'm glad that Star Ocean 6 brought it back, even though it put a little bit of a different spin, but still a welcome spin. And yes, the characters aren't 100% great, though I did like characters like, Miria and also Phase. I thought they were really cool, and the music itself was pretty solid. So yeah, aside from what people say about the writing, I think Star Ocean 4: The Last Hope is an underrated game. I think nowadays it should be looked more fondly, I would say, in a positive light, especially if you're going about the whole sci-fi things, especially since it's been able to, you're able to explore through multiple worlds at your own will, something that the series kind of lacked before. I mean, 3 kind of did, but it was never against you, it was more against your will, and something that 6 was close on doing, but not fully. So hopefully, when Star Ocean 7 comes, hopefully, Tri-Ace is given enough budget from Square Enix, and they do at least, take the ideas from Star Ocean 4 and revisit them and improve them, like a combination of the things that worked in Star Ocean 4 and 6 for a new Star Ocean game would absolutely be absolutely ideal. So that is my pick. Anyway guys, thank you guys so much for watching, and thanks for all the wonderful content creators for collaborating here and sharing out their picks. It was an absolute honor and pleasure to work with them, and by all means check out their YouTube channels, which I will leave a link on the description down below, as well as their Twitter page, so you can follow them. Anyway guys, with that said, thank you guys so much for watching. So until then, Mad Kaiser out.